Hello guys and welcome back to the SimpliCode programming channel. This is Vikesh and let's get started with today's topic, which is around MVC and the implementation of MVC using Spring. So before we go any further, let's first understand what do we mean by an MVC application. So in the previous lectures, I discussed about the three-tier application where you had a presentation layer, you had a business layer, and then you had a database layer, which is talking to the database. And that's how we built a three-tier application, which can also evolve into an n-tier application. But when the web development started, the most popular concept which came out was MVC. M stands for model, V stands for view, and C stands for controller. So the idea was that these three components together can render a web application. And how they render the web application is basically that the controller is going to receive the request which is coming from the web browser. Then the controller will have the knowledge of where the business logic for that particular request will be residing. So the controller is going to invoke the model, the corresponding model which is required to execute the business logic of the request. And the controller will also have the knowledge of what response page to be sent back to the user. So we are talking about the response page here, not response. Remember that, because it's a web application. So the model view controller architecture basically was designed to keep in mind that you have a web application where a request is coming from and you need to process some business logic, and then you need to return back with a page response which is going to be displayed on the web browser of the client machine. So that's why we had these three components as model, view, and controller. Controller taking up the request, then finding the right model for it which can execute the business logic, and then also finding the right view for it which can render the business logic processed by the model. So that's a quick overview about model view controller or MVC architecture. Do read about it in detail to understand how this works. But like I mentioned, that MVC, the most popular MVC implementation is provided by Spring. Spring is the most popular MVC framework, and the way Spring implements it is something which I have drawn already here. So let's understand how this works. So first, the request comes from the web browser, and Spring has a very first welcome servlet which is called dispatcher servlet. Any request which is coming to the Spring enabled web application will first hit dispatcher servlet. And once the request comes to the dispatcher servlet has all the knowledge of all the controllers, of all the view resolvers, which I will talk about in a while, and of all the views as well. It also has knowledge about handler mappings, which again I will just discuss now. So the basic premise is that dispatcher servlet is the component which has knowledge about literally everything happening in your application, and that's why dispatcher servlet is the first servlet or the first component which receives your web request. So once the request comes here, first of all it looks at the path and finds out the right handler for it, the right controller for it. And the way it does that by using the handler mapping component or handler mapping logic which is provided out of the box by Spring Framework. So the handler mapping logic will tell the dispatcher servlet which particular controller is going to process the request which is coming, because every request will have a different controller return. So whatever the type of request is, whatever the path of the request is, based on that, the dispatcher servlet is going to find a particular controller. Once the controller is found, like I mentioned earlier, the controller will have knowledge about the right model to invoke for that particular request. Model is nothing but basically a Java class holding the business logic for this particular request. So it will invoke that Java class and get all the business logic processed, and then it is going to return a model and view object. View is here simply pointing to the UI response which you are going to send back to the user. It can be a JSP page, it can be an HTML page, it can be any other view technology. So anything which is used to render a web application on a web page is view, and controller is going to send both the model and view information back to the dispatcher servlet. The dispatcher servlet will take the view part of it and go to another component which is again provided by Spring, which is called view resolver. The view resolver will have the knowledge to see which particular actual JSP or template to invoke for the view value coming from the controller. So based on the value which is returned by the controller, a view resolver is going to return the right page mapping. And once the dispatcher servlet knows the page mapping, it is just going to invoke that page by calling the view component. So dispatcher servlet, handler mapping, controller, view resolver, and view, these 5 components together help render a web MVC application in the Spring framework. So that was about the theory of how Spring works. Now let's move on to an example to understand how this works in action. So here I have already built a Spring MVC application, and if you're wondering how to build that, there's an easy way to do that using Spring Initializer, and that's also the recommended way. Actually, if you go to the documentation of Spring, you will see that it recommends creating a new project from scratch using the Spring Initializer utility, which is provided by Spring out of the box. So just go to a web browser and type start.spring.io. You will get this page where you can specify what type of project you want to create. So it is going to create the basic skeleton for any Spring application automatically for you. It's probably, like I said, it's probably the fastest way to get started with Spring. So we will choose a Maven project. Maven is again a dependency management tool which is used to download any kind of jars for your application. So we are going to use a Maven project and we want to create a skeleton for a Java application. We are going to use the latest released version of Spring or Spring Boot, which is 2.4.2. It says Spring Boot here, but don't get confused with it. We are going to use just the MVC classes and not the Spring Boot specific logic yet. Then you provide your group artifact ID and the name for your jar. You provide a description. You can provide a welcome package name, whatever suits you. And then how you would like to run your application. Whether you would like to package your application as a jar file, which is a Java archive, or you would like to run it as a web archive, which is a var file. So you can choose either packaging mode, and it is going to add appropriate dependencies inside the project to support the packaging of jar or the packaging of var. Then you can also choose the Java version. So you can see there are 3 Java versions listed here, which are 8, 11 and 15. So whichever Java version you are working on, you can choose that particular version. And once you have set everything, just hit generate. Once you do that, it is going to create a project here, and then you can import this project just as a normal project inside the Eclipse IDE. And that's exactly what I've done for this initial project, which is showing a very basic hello world sort of example for how Spring MVC will work. So this whole structure will automatically be created for you. And like I said, it was a Maven project, and in every Maven project, you will have a pom.xml. If I double click on this, it is going to open this XML and it will list down all the dependencies which my project needs to have. Let's understand the dependencies as well. So this project is currently using the properties of 1.8, but that's fine. You can obviously definitely change this value. I just kept it as 1.8 for now because I'm not using any new functionality yet. In the dependencies section, you will see all the dependencies or all the jars which are required by the Spring application to run successfully. The first dependency we see here is about DyMyLeaf, and DyMyLeaf basically is a view technology similar to JSP or similar to servlets technically, where you can use this DyMyLeaf templates, which are basically just HTMLs with some dynamic values, and you can use these DyMyLeaf templates to render web pages for your Spring MVC application. If you want to use some other view technology, you need to include the dependency of that view technology here instead of DyMyLeaf. So that's about that. Then you need to include the Spring Boot Starter Web. The Spring Boot Starter Web is going to enable your application to become a web application. Then this is basically a good to have dependency which you can have in your project, which will help you deploy the project at runtime automatically without restarting the server, because the web application will be running on a server, on a web server basically, or an application server technically, because it needs to run somewhere so that clients can access it. That's how a web client architecture works, or the server client architecture works. So this dependency will allow you to deploy changes dynamically at runtime without restarting the server. Then this dependency is for tests, if you're writing any unit tests. And then you have a plugin which will allow to run this particular project with a single command, which we will see in a while. So that's about the dependency tour. Now let's look at what is in the src main Java. In the src main Java, I just have 2 classes. One is the main class, which will have a public static void main method, and this is the entry point of the Spring application. and then I have a controller class. I already talked about what controller is, but I will come back to that in a while. Let's understand the rest of the files as well. The next one is src main resources, where you will have your view technology data available. Like I mentioned, it is using the myleaf templates currently, and basically, like I said, they are technically HTMLs with some dynamic data. So I've created a templates folder under src main resources, which will automatically be generated by Spring Initializer, and then under templates, I've placed an HTML file. It's a pure HTML file, with the only difference is this value. So this is what the dynamic value means, which is supported by the myleaf templates. Otherwise, this is pure HTML. It's just a paragraph with a header, and this is the dynamic value which I'm populating. It also has application.properties, which has nothing, but you can use this particular file to supply environment specific properties for the development environment or the testing environment or the real production environment. If you have any unit tests, those will go here under src test Java, and this is the system library already provided, supported by Eclipse itself. And I already talked about the Pom.xml. You also see a couple of more files created by Spring Boot. If you want to use that, you can use that to run the program from the command line as a utility. Otherwise, you can just use mvn spring boot command, which I will show you in a while. There's also a Gradle folder which you can ignore. Probably we don't need this because we are just using Maven and we are not using Gradle. Gradle is another dependency management tool very similar to Maven. So you can ignore this folder right now. So that's the structure. And now let's come back to the controllers. Remember, I told you that controllers are the ones which receive the request. So from the dispatcher servlet, which I talked about here, after the dispatcher servlet, the request comes to the controller. So once you hit a particular URL, then you need to create a controller for that URL mapping. Remember that you need to create a controller for almost every URL mapping you are having in your application. There should be some mapping to some controller somewhere. So I've created a greeting controller, and the way you specify or you make a simple class as a controller is by putting the @controller annotation. This is the annotation which is supported by Spring, and you can put this annotation on top of any class, and that class will be treated as controller by Spring. And the moment you put this class will also be registered with the dispatcher servlet. And like I mentioned, the controller's main purpose is to receive the requests, the web requests which are coming from the client. And the way you can receive the requests to a controller by providing the exact URL mapping. So if somebody runs this web application and says /greeting, then this particular method should get invoked. And how you define that is with the get mapping annotation. Use the get mapping annotation to provide the URL path. Whenever somebody invokes this URL path, this method would be getting called. And when this method is getting called, at that same time, this URL can also accept some query parameters. We call that as request parameters in the Spring language. So you can use the request parameters as an annotation to provide a placeholder for the variable for which the value will be supplied in the URL. So /greeting, if you call this URL something like this, then it will work because you have a variable called name which is being parsed as a query string because you have used the request param annotation. So we'll see an example of that once we run this application and how we can supply the query string. But you use the request param annotation to supply the query string parameters to the URL. You can mention if the parameter is mandatory or non-mandatory. If the required equal to true was there, then this parameter would be mandatory. You can also supply a default value if the client is not providing this query parameter at all. Would you like to set any default value? If yes, you can supply that default value here. And then you just give a placeholder name like I said. Then the second argument which your methods which are intercepting the request should have is the model argument. And remember, I told you that the controller will have or should have the knowledge about the model. And from here that knowledge comes. This particular method will expect you to provide a model argument as well. So if somebody calls this application and provides the URLs with /greeting, this particular method will get invoked, and then the code inside this method will be getting executed. So it's a very simple code right now, but this is where your whole logic will go. Remember that. But here I'm just saying model.add attribute name with the value which is coming from the query string parameter. That's all I'm doing here. And remember I told you that the model will hold the business logic. So here this is the business logic where whatever query string parameter which is coming from the request param, I'm capturing that and I'm adding that value with the variable name in the attributes of the model. So my model is set, and after that I need to return the view so that this particular file name will be intercepted by the view resolver here. If you remember, we talked about the view resolver. So when we return greetings as a string, that string goes here, and then dispatcher servlet looks out, asks the view resolver to find a particular HTML matching with this particular text. So view resolver is going to look at under src main resources / templates to see if there is a file with the name greeting available or not. Since we have that file available, the Spring is going to render this particular file supplying the model attribute value name. Now remember, the greeting.html had the exact same variable name. So this variable name should exactly match with this variable name here. If you make a mistake here, this is not going to work because the model is holding the business logic and I'm printing that business logic inside the view using the die-my-leaf template syntax, which is $curly braces. So whenever you have to print any variable or a model attribute or any runtime value inside a die-my-leaf template, then you need to use the $curly braces syntax to do that. So that was about a quick overview of how this application is written right now. And that's all the code is here. Now it's time to run this application. So one of the simplest way to run this application would be to provide a Spring run configuration here for the Spring application, or you can choose another way, which is to first have a look at the Spring Web Content application, which is the entry point. So once your application boots up, this is the first line of code which is going to get executed. And to make sure that this code works, make sure that you have the @Spring Boot application annotation on top of the entry point class. So this is sort of the mandate which Spring will force you to put in front of the or on top of the entry point class to treat this class as the first entry point when you run the project. So to run the project, what we will do, that we will just go to the command line and we will say mvn spring boot run. So let's do that, and let me open the terminal for that. So I have opened a git bash prompt here. You can also open the classic Windows terminal, but this is something which Git installs by default if you install Git on your system. It's pretty much exactly the same. It's just more Unix-like, but it's also just a simple terminal shell utility to access your file system. So I have gone to the project which we were working with in the Eclipse IDE, and this is the path of the project. So once you reach to the path, what you would like to run is just say mvn spring-boot : run. That's it, and you hit enter. Once you write mvn spring-boot : run, you will see lot of code, lot of logs here where it is going to compile all the Java classes, run any tests if there are any, and then it is going to start the web content application. You can see, and once the application is started, you will get this message that everything is run. One of the interesting thing which you can see here is that it is also spinning up an application server automatically for you, and that application server here which is being used by Spring is Apache Tomcat. Technically, Apache Tomcat is a servlet container and it's not a full-fledged application server, but just to get the point across, you can use Apache Tomcat as an application server which is being used here out of the box by Spring. If you don't want to use Apache Tomcat and you want to use something else, you can do that as well. So now everything is ready and we can now execute the application to observe the output. So for that, let me open a fresh browser window so that we don't get any cached response. And now I can just type localhost 8080. And if I hit enter, I get a white label error page because there is no home page for Tomcat defined, but there is a home page for my application defined. In fact, let's try to access the URL which we wrote in the greeting controller. The URL was /greeting. So let's copy this and let's put this here. So localhost 8080 /greeting. And if I hit enter, I get the message hello world. Let me just zoom this in a bit so that you can see. So you will see this hello world message here by putting this URL. Why do we see hello world? let's go back to the controller. So when you call this URL, this greeting controller got invoked. Since we did not provide any query string parameter, the default value, which was world, was picked up, and this world value was stored in the name variable, and the name variable was added as an attribute to the model. And then we were using the greeting.html and we were printing the name variable. Since the name variable was holding the value world, so the message came as hello world with an exclamation, and that's the output which we see here. Now let's try to supply the query string parameter. The way you do that is provide a question mark, provide the key of the query string parameter and the value you want to put here. So let's put SimpliCode as a value and hit enter. So now the message got changed and now it says hello SimpliCode. So what happened here is that whatever query string parameter we supplied, that got passed here as part of the request param, and the value of SimpliCode got stored in this name key and in turn in this name variable, and then I added the same value into another name attribute and added that attribute to the model. So now this name here is storing the value SimpliCode, and then all the things work exactly as the same as I just described. It goes to greeting.html and it prints whatever is stored in the name attribute coming from the model. And that's all I want to cover for this particular session. In the next session, we are going to look at how we can build a Spring Boot application to build a REST web service. If you like this video, a thumbs up would be massively appreciated. And please don't forget to subscribe to SimpliCode for more programming related videos. Thank you, and we'll meet again in the next session.